Chika Okeke-Agulu is an artist and professor of African and American diaspora art at Princeton University. He's in New Jersey in the USA. Enotie Ogbebor is an artist and a trustee of the Legacy Restoration Trust. He's in Benin City in Nigeria. Gentlemen, thank you so much indeed for your time. Enotie, I have to start with you because of this latest news that the Church of England, which has gifted 2 Benin Bronzes, said they're coming back to Nigeria. And I believe, am I right, they're coming back to the museum that you're working with and for.
Yes, definitely. They'll be brought back to eventually be kept in the museum, EMOA, Edo Museum for West African Arts, that we plan on building. But before the museum is completed, we intend to build a pavilion. This pavilion will hold these items until the museum is ready.
That is fantastic news. And obviously, these are complicated negotiations. It might seem straightforward, Chika, that a former colony should have back what was taken from it and almost always taken illegally. And we'll get into the details of what might be legal and what might not be. But there is an argument in the West. Some people are saying that actually all of these artifacts, of which there are tens of thousands, are actually better cared for in Western museums than going back to their land of origin. What do you think of that?
Well, that is one of these really crazy arguments for someone who stole a neighbor's property to then argue that his house, where the stolen property is much better endowed to host the stolen property than the home of the owner from which these things were stolen. So I think it's an argument by the wealthy and the powerful to show why they ought to be the guardians of human heritage. And that's really the kind of arrogance that we tend to think of as belonging in the colonial period rather than in this moment that we live in.
Enotie, I understand the museum that is going to house these Benin Bronzes is not just going to be for Nigerian artifacts, it's also going to include artifacts from other West African countries. And certainly Ghana is a West African country that wants some of its stolen artifacts back. You go to East Africa, Kenya has done the same. Further north, Ethiopia has done the same. Tell us a bit about the history of African patrimony that isn't in Africa anymore.
Well, basically, the artifacts which have been looted were made over 800 years ago. And these works were produced for different reasons. Some were produced for religious purposes. They were used to decorate shrine altars for traditional forms of worship. And some were produced as artifacts for record keeping, for recording history. And some were produced for decorative purposes. Actually, the decorative ones also serve dual purpose, both to recording history and also to be used for decorative purposes. We also had some that were made for particular ceremonies, and there are artifacts that were also made as utensils. Now, collectively, these artifacts form what you call our history, our heritage, and is akin to put it in context, it's like removing the works of Da Vinci, Michelangelo, all the way to Van Gogh, Picasso, Bach, Beethoven, Shakespeare. Just imagine removing all these works from Europe in the last 124 years, and imagine where the civilization of Europe would have been by now. So these works represent our collective identity, our history, our heritage, our culture, and the soul of our people. And so it's important that these works are brought back so that those of us who are living in Africa today can see what the excellence which our ancestors strove to achieve through these works And then we can also draw inspiration from this and learn a bit more of our culture and heritage.
Sure. Listen, Chika, I know you're nodding and you would probably say something very similar. So, I mean, just because time is tight, I want to address a few different issues. And you kind of alluded to it when you talked about the arrogance of colonialism. Many people, and both of you will almost certainly, I believe, say the same thing, that not giving back these artifacts is just an extension of colonialism. But there is a complication sometimes, because we're talking about the Belgian Empire, the German Empire, the French Empire, the British Empire, the Spanish Empire. A lot of this stuff wasn't necessarily directly stolen by those empires, but former colonial powers would exchange these and give them sometimes as gifts to other leaders of other empires. So what might be in the UK might not all be stolen. So does the UK still have to give all of that back that it didn't take directly?
Well, my approach to this is, and I think that there's a case in the law, although I'm not a lawyer, but if you are keeping stolen property, you're keeping it even though you're not the one that stole the property or expropriated it. That doesn't give you coverage for keeping them. And so the question of what happened, for instance, with the Benin Bronzes, we know that when they arrived in England, the Home Office sold them off in order to pay for the military campaign of the so-called punitive expedition to Benin City. And so the fact that they sold these illegally or criminally acquired objects to other European museums does not give them cover to keep them. So I would think that as the case we're now seeing in Germany, the German Minister of Culture recently announced that they will be returning the Benin Bronzes that are in the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, which, by the way, has the second most highest number of Benin Bronzes, that they will be returned to Nigeria. Now, that sets a precedent for other countries that may have bought or they have Benin Bronzes that were gifted to them. They need to return them because these were illegally acquired objects. They were expropriated from the palace of the Oba of Benin and ought to be returned. Whether or not they bought them from the stealers or they were gifted to them from the looters does not give them the right or privilege to keep them.
Enotie, I've read an analysis that says Western wealth, to the extent that even the Western banking system, that is, of course, worth trillions and trillions of dollars, simply wouldn't exist if colonial powers had not looted from their colonies. Is this sort of artwork, these artifacts, just an example of how the West has built its wealth?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's obvious that this, it all started from Berlin, at the Berlin Conference in 1884, where Africa was partitioned by about 13 countries, European countries that attended this Berlin Conference. And after the partitioning, these European countries now went to Africa, started partitioning the place, sacking the rulers, and taking the cultural artifacts and also the wealth of the land. For example, palm oil, rubber, minerals, to build Europe as we know it today. And so it's obvious that without the brazen exploitation of Africa, which started from the Berlin Conference of 1884, the effrontery and the confidence for these countries to come into Africa to carry out the dastardly acts which they perpetrated would have been impossible.
Okay, Chika, I'm going to end with you. I'm just going to give you an open-ended opportunity to just sum this up for us. But I want to start by saying that in 2018, the French government commissioned a report about these sorts of artifacts because, of course, we've talked about many empires looting. And that report found that up to 90% of sub-Saharan Africa's material cultural legacy is outside the continent. I told that to my editor, and he almost fell out of his seat.
Well, anybody would. I think your editor's reaction is a natural human reaction. The depth and scale of the expropriation of the African continent, both in terms of its material wealth, but also its cultural heritage. If you go to some of these museums in Europe, they are chock full of thousands, tens of thousands of objects that are locked up in their vaults and storage rooms, not even in the galleries where they will be seen by the rest of the world. And they're keeping these things as cultural assets. We know the financial implication of having these vast amounts of really very valuable cultural property within the vaults of these museums. And so to the extent that they are willing and being compelled to return some of the finest examples of Benin cultural heritage, I think that's the right thing to do. The Oba of Benin and the Nigerian authorities may decide eventually to allow them to keep some as cultural ambassadors, as the Oba of Benin has said recently. But that's the decision that he has to make. That's the decision the palace in Benin will make, in terms of extending diplomatic courtesy to some of these countries by allowing them, perhaps, to keep some of the objects in their museums and galleries. But it should not be the case that the looters and the keepers of the looters will be dictating the fate of these objects. What that
Chika,
indicates is really...
Okay, sorry to interrupt you. You know what? We have actually run out of time anyway, but if anybody is wondering whether you're coming from a position of bias, the Musée Royal de l'Afrique Centrale in Belgium, it has 180,000 pieces of African artifacts. Really appreciate it to both of you, Chika Okeke-Agulu and Enotie Ogbebor. Take care, gentlemen.